It's your opportunity, ladies and gentlemen, to put your questions. Yes, sir. What's your question?
Thank you. What is the importance of trade deals with China and the United States, and what is the effect on those trade deals whether we allow Huawei into our 5G network?
Well, first of all, I think one has to be very, very careful about doing a trade deal with China. There are massive distortions in the Chinese economy, and unless you think you're capable of knocking those down in a trade deal, you need to. This is one area where I think, and that's what the TPP was all about. The TPP was really about China. It was about a group of countries ensuring that they had a platform in place that would simultaneously encourage the Chinese to lower their level of distortion, but also be a bit of a stick if they didn't. I think we should be careful about the possibility of doing a deal with the Chinese on a bilateral trade deal. The Huawei issue is a very serious issue. I think has been massively underestimated by the UK government. How seriously how seriously the Americans and the Australians and the other Five Eyes members take this. This is an existential threat. Just to give you some anecdotal stuff, even the Japanese, I was in a meeting with a Japanese official, and the Japanese are not noted for their aggressive use of language. We were told in this delegation, I and a colleague were at, that the UK's decision on Huawei was idiotic. That's a really strong statement from the Japanese. And just to take this back, I represented Lucent Technologies in 1997, which was spun out of AT&T, provided telephone equipment in the US and around the world. There was this little Chinese company called Huawei, and we were bidding at X, and they were bidding at X over 3, not X minus 3, X over 3, because they had huge Chinese subventions, massive distortions. They were ripping off intellectual property in PLA silos. Some of that has changed, but the legacy effects of that remain, and the effects of the red telephone on the desk of the CEO that goes back to Communist Party headquarters is still there. So we have to. I think the UK government has been very naive about China. There is a book that I would recommend everybody read by a US China expert, Mike Pillsbury, called The 100-Year Marathon. And he outlines what China's policy is and was from the days of when they opened. And I was very involved in the Chinese WTO accession. I think there was a moment after their accession when the reform-minded people in the Chinese government had a bit of critical mass. And we could have been on a path if we'd done the right things and they'd done the right things to a more market-based economy in China. But as of 2006, 2007, that changed. The financial crisis was very damaging because the Chinese planners basically said, well, we told you, free market capitalist system, this is what you get, and they sort of retook to some extent a measure of power. So we have to be extremely careful. The US is not going to let this go. We will have to find a way of getting them out of our networks.
I haven't got much to add to that, but I think everyone in this room are all concerned about Huawei. I know that there's many MPs in Parliament who are more experts in this than I am. There's IDS, there's David Davis, who's got campaigns in Parliament, and they're in dialogue with the Prime Minister as well. But they do say that they haven't got access. Is this correct, Shanker, to our secure zone? as well. That's what my understanding is.
Well, I mean, the problem is that in 5G, the secure and the periphery, the core and the periphery are really blended. So it's quite hard to make that. And obviously, as time goes on, especially when you go to 6G in the cloud, it's all one. It all becomes one. What they have the ability to do with 5G is, and I'm not suggesting the Chinese want to do this, but what they have the ability to do is, it's not just about surveillance. Surveillance is happening, and we just live in a world where that is just going on. But they have the ability to shut off systems. Not that they ever want to shut off a system, but what you will find, and this is related to their geopolitical operations in the Indian Ocean and in other places in the South China Sea, is what you will find is they will want to do something, and maybe it's a relatively minor thing, or maybe it's just taking control of Taiwan, or maybe it's something else, or maybe it's building a bit more in the South China Sea. And the West will be told that they do have this ability to stop your systems and to interfere with your systems. But if you're just reasonable on their global aspirations, then they won't do that. That's not a world I want to live in.
Absolutely.
Thank you very much for those answers. Yes, a gentleman there in the glasses.
It seems probably to us that the rule of law is important. And unfortunately, there's the issue of law being applied equally to all parties. In my experience, this isn't happening in this country. The law is not being applied equally. There are people who
Could you just move to the question? Because we've got a lot of
so
other people.
what I need to know from you is, to what extent should the law, this may be a simple answer, to what extent should the law apply equally to all parties?
Thank you. Anybody like to comment from the platform on that?
Can I just ask, what was you referring to in particular? What case?
Oh, number of cases.
Do you want to give an example so we know where you're coming from, please?
The States Liaison, the States Reform, the Lease Reform Act 1993, where one party doesn't have to obey the law, doesn't have to obey the regulations, doesn't have to obey court directions, and the other party does.
Okay.
And this is just one of a vast number that I've observed.
Okay.
I don't know whether the panel feel they have any expertise.
No, not really. I mean, all I'd say is, the rule of law must be applied. I mean, I don't agree with positive discrimination. I think, to me, we're all human beings and everybody should be treated equally. So
The only thing I would say is when we talk about rule of law, the common law is probably the most important UK export ever in history. And when we talk about rule of law, quite often other countries, when they talk about rule of law, they really are talking about rule of lawyers. And it's about twisting and changing the regulatory system to the advantage of the powerful, to the advantage of the incumbent. And that's what I think we need to ensure. The net result of this process that we're engaged in is that is not true. That cannot be said of the UK economy.
yeah,
Thank you, Sir Shanker. Yes, gentleman there, your question, please, sir.
Well, what Shanker just said about the common law couldn't be more to the point, because we have a great divide between traditional British law deriving from the common law, which derives from Saxon law, in fact. And then on the other side, we have continental law, which they call the Napoleonic Code, but it's really Roman law. And in the 17th century, here it was applied in the religious and royal courts, and it was called the civil law. So there was one of the great motivations of the Great Rebellion in the 17th century was to get rid of the civil law. And that's what we're faced with again now, just as you pointed out, that we're perceiving law based on the common law, which we think of, that they don't understand on the continent at all. And they think that the law is essentially inquisitorial. So, for instance, you are presumed guilty until proved innocent, which is the opposite of the way we look at things. So, Shanker, what can you suggest about how on earth we break through this lack of perception of the two different universes of law?
Well, I mean, that's a great question. One of the things that has happened in the last period while we've been members of the EU has been that it actually makes them law of the land. But because of being a member of the European Union, we've become a monist system where laws have direct effect without Parliament's involvement. And that was a significant shift that went on without anyone really, again, probably except for the people in this room, paying attention. I think the way to solve this going forward is partly it's to do with the nature of the people that we negotiate agreements with. And if you look at the list, it's the US, it's Australia, it's New Zealand, Japan, most of those, and most of the TPP members, and most of the Commonwealth countries are common law countries. And the other, where it's going to become a problem in the negotiation with the EU is they have a very, very legalistic, and as I said before, rule of lawyer, not rule of law type approach. And that's the approach they will be taking. Now, our approach will be, what is the objective? What are we trying to achieve? How do we achieve it? And that is obviously now colliding. But I think you have to have options. You have to be able to walk away, which is the biggest option that you have, and then you have to have something to walk away into. So, and it's got to be credible. So as long as we got these deals moving forward with other countries, as long as we are able to improve our own regulatory system along those common law lines, then I think we will be in a position to get them to agree with the things that we are proposing in the negotiations.
Thank you very much indeed for that answer. Yes, sir. Towards the back, yes, the gentleman. Yes, you, sir. Could you put your question? There's a gentleman behind you.
Oh, sorry.
John, your question, please. John, could you give the mic to John? Thank you so much.
John Strafford. 100 billion HS2, 20 billion Bridge to Ireland, 15 billion foreign aid, subsidies for onshore wind farms, replacement of gas boilers by 2025, replacement of cars, diesel and petrol by 2035. Who is going to pay for all these things? Because those Labour voters that led their votes to the Conservatives are going to be paying for them and getting no benefit from it. And so unless we address that and stop spreading money like confetti, come next election, they will go back to where they belonged in the first place.
Thank you very much, John. It's a shame Mark had to leave early, but I'll put the question to our parliamentary representative.
I mean, like Shanker said earlier, it is getting the basics right. You need to know your food bill is lower, your clothing, your energy costs, etc. And I know what we're hearing about proposed fuel duty rise. Speaking to my constituents, they're deeply concerned about this, and they care more about actually paying the bills and getting through each week rather than the environmental policy. So no, I agree, and we're Conservatives here in this room, and we should be fiscal Conservatives. I'm sure. I think the difficulty for the Prime Minister is because we've had votes lent to us in these areas which literally consecutive governments, both Labour and Conservative, haven't delivered for. So they've got a tough ask ahead, because they have got to deliver and make sure that these people's daily lives actually feel that they're better under Conservative government, what they voted for. But at the same time, I don't want us overspending and getting into this same area like they did in the Brown years. So it's getting the balance right then. I do think the Prime Minister's got a really tough task ahead.
Yeah, I would just say that I think this is what I talked about in terms of my fear going forward, which is that the domestic regulatory choices the UK will make will be damaging to growth, damaging to their future prospects, and damage their trade relationships. And you've cited a few examples of spending and a few examples of regulation that are anti-competitive and destructive of wealth creation. And I think people who believe in economic freedom, you know, where you are going to be called to speak over the next few years is precisely this area, is making it clear what the costs are, and also, more importantly, when you choose policies that are anti-competitive, that destroy wealth out of the economy, that cause prices to go up, and because environment is related to energy, and because energy is in everything, that it causes prices of everything to go up. That is it's a nuisance for people who are rich. It is a catastrophe for people who are poor. And I think we have to be very, very clear about this, because a lot of those people voted Conservative for the first time in their, not just their lives, but the lives of their generations before them. It is a terrific opportunity to bring the country together, to reset the political agenda of the country. But if you continue to do these things, I would say to the government, you're going to lose all of that.
Yeah, I think it's absolutely vital on this issue that growth in the next coming months and years is given a very high priority in the government strategy.
I agree.
We are going to need a growing economy with so many difficult decisions having to be taken. And we've got to get that wind behind us, and that should be the number one priority. Yeah, I'll take another question from that gentleman there. Yes.
Thank you very much. I work for the Department for International Trade, here in private capacity, of course. I've listened with great interest. I work on long-term strategic questions, so it's looking at the day-to-day work of my colleagues and trying to place it into longer strategic context. And we're coming up with solutions to some of the questions you raised as well. My question concerns the European Union, because the opening positions have been set out and they're very far apart, not so much on substance but more on the form and the governance around it. The Europeans have always been good at offering subsidies, regulation, whatever, but in exchange for taking away sovereignty, and we want to get our sovereignty back. Now, the European style of diplomacy is very German. It is the total concept, the Gesamtkonzept, where they lay everything on the table. Yep. They lay out their position, they lay out what they understand your position to be, they lay out how those two positions can be brought together, they lay out the logic behind that, and they want you to accept the logic more than the substance. But that's where the problem lies, because part of the European or German approach to diplomacy is to link everything together. Don't you care about human rights? Well, this is linked to the Treaty on Human Rights. This is linked to the court. This means that the court will have to govern over you. You don't want the court to govern over you. You mean you're opposed to human rights? And that's how it goes. And it's the security discussion. For example, sharing databases on criminals and stuff that's probably good to continue with is linked to everything else. So a disagreement on fish can then lead to a breakdown that also ends security cooperation. So my question is, what, with a good spirit of British common sense and pragmatism, how can we break the European insistence on linkage in the diplomatic context? Because that will be the key to making progress. It's ultimately not substance, but ultimately form of the diplomacy. That's the problem. That's my question. What do you think?
Andrea?
I think on the trade negotiation point, on how we negotiate, we have to learn the lessons of the past. And the first lesson that we learned from the past, we allowed them to have the pen. We allowed them to basically dictate the sequencing, dictate everything, and we were just responding to that. Now, I think the current government approach is very, very different. I think that's why Boris made the speech in Greenwich. If you notice the Greenwich speech, which was billed as a speech about our relationship with the EU, all the journalists came there assuming they were going to hear about what we were going to do with the EU, and he spent the first 60% of the speech talking about the rest of the world, because he was deliberately putting the EU in the global context, which is something that his predecessor never did. And that was really, really important to note that. So I think I see positive, signs here. The David Frost speech in Brussels was also a deliberate attempt to set. You should look at these two speeches as sort of pillars in the UK process going forward. But the most important thing is to get control of the negotiating pen and to put your own text on the table and say, what with this do you disagree? Because actually it does satisfy a lot of their concerns. We drafted a EU-UK FTA, as some of you know, published it in February of 2019, launched it with David Davis and Greg Hands, who's now the Trade Policy Minister. And that's the kind of agreement, and we made the point of saying that everything in this agreement, maybe not every bit of the agreement, but every concept in this agreement is something that you, the EU, have already done with somebody else. It might be very small, it might be the New Zealand EU veterinary agreement on SPS regulatory issues, but you've done it somewhere. We're not telling you, we're not asking you to do anything you haven't done before. And if you do that, then I think you've got a chance. But if you allow them to take control of the process, and even little optical things, like the fact that they are now alternating the venue of the negotiations, the fact that we were constantly going to Brussels.
That's true.
No negotiation operates like that. So this matters, and it will strengthen our hand, I think.
Thank you, Shanker.
Completely agree with Shanker again. But also, where they bring logic into it, I think we actually bring facts and discuss outcomes. Now, I think we should remind them that, they are the slowest trading bloc. Like we said, by 2050, they'll only have 10% of the world trade. And where they say that we don't care about, the human rights, the working times directive, etc., we should remind them that, look at, for example, our maternity pay and benefits is far...
Yes, first the lady on the end, then I'll come to you.
First you, thank you. Thank you. Alexa Michael from Bromley. My question is perhaps aimed more at Andrea and her comments on immigration and attracting the best and the brightest to Britain.
Yeah.
We hear a lot about the country being at full employment, but it remains the case that youth employment is something like 11%, and there are about 800,000 young people who are not in employment, education or training, known as NEETs. So can I ask, do you support encouraging our employers to take on our own people, to employ our own people, especially the young, in order to improve employment figures?
Thank you.
Thank you.
Andrea.
Very good question. And I think that our own people ought to do these jobs. I remember when I was a counsellor in Lincolnshire, a Lincolnshire County counsellor, and I spoke at one of the schools, and I remember one of the questions from the teachers was, look, what about some of our kids here? There's not much for them to do. And I said, well, what about the rural economy? When I was young, my sisters and I in Yorkshire, we used to pick potatoes. We did. I think what the trouble was under the Blair government, we're trying to push far too many people to go to university, and I think that's lowered the standards. Now, I went as a mature student, and some of my university lecturers said to me that outcome was actually that, we'd be getting people to university who couldn't get the basic spelling and grammar right, who was going to do a degree, when actually, they might have been better doing more vocational stuff, doing an apprenticeship. I mean, I started off at Greg's Bakery at 16, started on the shop floor, worked my way up to senior management, and it was that life experience what mattered to me, and I had to prove to myself as a mature adult that I could, you know, do the academic route as well. So I think it's good that the government, and right since Cameron's time, we've been investing in apprenticeships, but I do think we need to make sure that that is seen as something what's as important as going to university. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you. Thank you indeed. Yes, and you, madam, I promised you a question.
Thank you. I'm going to just comment on that because it happened now. As an architect, I find it quite infuriating that I can't find a decent plumber who speaks English. But that's beside the point. We used to have trade schools. We need to put them back and give them degrees equal to university with equal respect. That is why Tony Blair wanted everybody to go to uni, so that they feel important.
Yeah.
And I think we've got to make trade feel important. But what I wanted to ask you, I didn't agree with the third runway, and I'm delighted that it's probably off the box. But I do agree with lighting up the north. When I studied international development, I was always told, first you get the transport, then you get the trade.
Completely.
And the HS2 doesn't go far enough. How about building the third runway and maybe a fourth runway in Manchester?
Thank you, madam. Thank you for that. Any comments?
Yeah, I mean, trade schools, completely agree, but I think it's good that the government's bringing this T-level in. But my only concern is that we're going to be getting rid of a lot of BTECs. We need to get rid of, some of the BTECs where they're not really employability skills. I think that's what's important. To me, education is actually about, equipping young people for life, they're resilient, they're ready for work. And I think that that's what our education system should be about now. So trade schools, T-levels, agree. I think we should build the third runway, but I'm not a Londoner, so I guess I would say that. And I agree, fourth, fifth runway, completely. We need to light up the north and the Midlands and every corner of this country. That's the only way we're going to bring the country together. Thank you.
Yes, sir. I'll take your question now. Yes.
Thank you. My name is Brian Weller. Thank you. I was just wondering, when will we hear more about the Constitution and Rights Commission and what they might plan for the Judiciary and our human rights in general, which need to be reformed?
I don't know if either our panellists have got a feel for the timescale on these developments. I think it could be quite a while.
I'm not aware of the timescale.
I don't know about the timescale of that. No. But what I would say though is that we do have an Attorney General now who is pretty clear about the importance of constitutional reform, and is pretty clear about the division. I mean, one of the things about this whole issue is, and it goes back to the question about the common law, what is our vision of rights and privileges? In a common law view, your rights are things the government must grant you, therefore they're things like the protection of your security and your person and your economic freedom, and everything else is a privilege. Well, that's not a civil law construct. A civil law construct is permission. Everything is a right, it seems to me, and that's what the European Court of Human Rights, that's what the Convention on Human Rights is built on, that's what the UN Convention on Human Rights is built on, and so all I would say is I think Suella fully understands. I think the Attorney General, for the first time in quite a long time, we got an Attorney General who gets that.
Yeah.
And so I would expect to see, in terms of separation of powers and all of the constitutional reforms, that there will be movement fairly quickly on it.
Thank you. Now, I'll take a question from my former colleague, Sir Ivan Lawrence.
Thank you. This question of law is terribly important and much misunderstood and underrated. The difference between the continental system and ours is not that the rule of law is the rule of lawyers, if you'll forgive me criticising your point, Shanker. the difference between our systems is that our judicial system is independent of government. And the continental system is made up of judges who are essentially civil servants. Now, that makes a tremendous difference in our attitudes, and only when we were part of the European system did we have to follow their rules and regulations. Now that we're not part of the European system, and once again we come back to common law, there's a tremendous difficulty about us reconciling the arrangements we make with Europe, and a far more important activity with us making arrangements with the Commonwealth and the United States, which are Commonwealth countries. Our common market countries. I'm sorry, common law countries. So we must keep this very much in mind. It causes great problems for us, not just over human rights and civil liberties and things like that, but the independence of our judiciary and our legal system is absolutely fundamental to how Britain works. And the civil servants that make up the judiciary in the continental countries simply don't register on that screen. So I hope that our negotiators and our thinkers bear that very much in mind, and it does lead us to concentrate more on the Commonwealth and the United States than the countries that don't have an independent judicial system.
I think, thank you, Ivan, for that very effective intervention. I don't know whether you'd like to comment, would you, Shanker?
Because I think it's a very important point. And there are many differences between the civil law and the that is certainly one, but one of them is also the fact that the permissibility, the fact that in the common law system you have a limited number of rights and you have everything else as a privilege, and you can do pretty much what you want unless the law provides you can't. Whereas under the civil law system you have a system that is much more based on you can only do things if the law provides that you can do them. And this is why it's so important that the government has taken the position that we are not going to put any part of our legal order under European supervision. Now, if you look at the Chequers Agreement and the Theresa May Agreement, whole swathes of our legal order would have been under European supervision forever. And I think they get that is really important. And it plays out in not just, as you said, not just in human rights and all these other areas. It plays out in very commercial areas of competition policy and our approach to antitrust, our approach to economic law. The common law is a much better sort of container, if you will, or cabins real economic forces, and it's a much better container of economic issues. And that's why if you look at the tension between the European approach to competition versus, which is a very interventionist approach, very much using competition as a way to break up big companies that they don't like, or to structure themselves the way the market should function. Whereas the US vision of antitrust developed over decades, and really primarily, brought about during the time of Ronald Reagan, was to be much more, I hesitate to use the word laissez-faire, but that's basically what it was. It was essentially, competition was about real economic choices. What was the real goal of competition policy was to ensure consumer welfare enhancement in economic terms. And that's one of the reasons that the US is outrunning the EU on a lot of economic and technological development issues. So this is fundamentally important. The regulatory system that you have will really define your ability to be the innovator of the future. So it does cover every area.
Andrea?
Just briefly, because I know you've got another question waiting. Common law is common outside the EU. And let's not forget that 90% of the trade is outside the EU. So what I'd like to see the government doing is having, tons of trade agreements set up and ready to go, these next few months. So when we get to December, it strengthens our hand even more that, we are going to be trading with Commonwealth countries, with the US. We've got the trade deals there ready, and that should always supersede what we're doing with the EU. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed. We're coming up to break time, but I've just got time for one more question. Yes, sir.
In terms of having something to walk away to, I'm sure none of us here are frightened of WTO, but for those that might still be, could you talk about the possibility maybe of using Article 24, for instance, again at the end of December? And secondly, also the improvements that have been made in WTO, such as TFA, which was introduced in 2017, the move towards global standards. I've forgotten the name of the agency, is it UNICE or something? These type of things which are moving the world towards frictionless trade anyway. Thank you.
Shanker, would you like to comment first on this?
Sure. In terms of, you mentioned Article 24. Article 24 of the GATT is all it says. There's been quite a lot of talk about this. It's not always been helpful. All it says is that, as the general rule is that you should reduce your trade barriers multilaterally in the WTO, but there is a special exemption for free trade agreements if they cover substantially all trade, and if they are more trade creative than trade distortive. So it's been always open for the EU and the UK to agree an agreement under Article 24 of the GATT and Article 5 of the GATTs. But it requires their agreement. So without their agreement, no, there's nothing. It requires their agreement, and if they're not going to agree with you an FTA in the time, they're not going to agree with you something else. So it doesn't. Now, when I say you need something to fall into, what I suggest that we fall into is obviously the WTO is the main system that we will be in, but we will hopefully we will be agreeing with the US, with Australia, with New Zealand, with Japan, with these other arrangements, and this will be an ongoing process. It's not like everything stops in December. We will continue to negotiate with others. We will continue to do. A lot of trade relies on mutual recognition agreements. It isn't always FTAs. We will continue to do all of those things with as many partners in the world who want to do them with us. And as long as we've got momentum for those things and we're driving things forward, then I think we have enough leverage to be able to say to the EU, if they insist on, for example, some parts of our legal order being under their supervision in order to get an FTA, we'll have enough leverage at that point to say no, we're not going to do that. The sooner they realise that, the better. That's one of the reasons why it's quite good to say in our negotiating objectives that July would be an important date. If we haven't agreed these things by July, if we don't know the contours of the agreement by July, that's it, basically, because that's not saying we want to move the deadline from December to July. It's saying this is quite a binary choice. It's quite easy for the EU to say either they're going to say that you're only going to get a trade deal if you are under our legal order in some way, or they don't. Or they say we're going to negotiate as two independent sovereigns. You can make that decision tomorrow. So let's make that decision. Decide EU whatever you want, and the sooner we know that, the better. So I think that's why the July deadline is there. But I think we've got lots of options. It's really important for us to realise and remember that we have lots of options. They don't have a lot of options. They've got as far as they can really get in terms of their liberalisation agenda around the world. It's going to be very difficult for them to negotiate an agreement with the with the US. I was involved in the TTIP 1 negotiation. It failed on regulatory grounds. It failed on a lot of these legal questions that you raised about fundamental difference in approach to regulation. And I think it's going to be very difficult for them to get an agreement with others.
Thank you very much. I think this has been a really very effective session.